Hello traders at CMC Markets. Welcome to a new update by RRG Research for Monday the 12th of November. My name is Julius de Kempenaer and I am presenting to you from Amsterdam in the Netherlands. Let's take a look at what's happening in rotations across various equity stock markets around the world. As usual, I have got the weekly RRG on the left-hand side of my screen and the daily on the right-hand side. And you can see it's a bit scattered all over the place. I think if we start with the daily, that's probably interesting right now because a lot happened last week with a probably unexpected rally, especially in the US. And what we see here, if we look at this, then you can see that it is actually dominated by US markets, because here's the New York FANG. Look at that very rapid rise, followed by the NASDAQ, rapid rise. And then you see the S&P, which is trailing behind a little bit. Obviously, it's a larger index, so that's not a surprise. And then we've got the Dow Jones, which is still moving into that negative direction. We see that very often, that the Dow Jones is kind of isolated from the broader markets in the US. But what I want to concentrate on right now is the rapid improvement of the New York FANG, the NASDAQ, and to a lesser degree, the S&P 500. If you look at all the other tails on this RRG, you see that, Europe, DAX, CAC, this is Australia, this is the Nifty, this is the FTSE. They're all pointing into that lower left-hand corner. That's a negative direction. And the only one that can kind of escape that, it looks to be the Nikkei index, the Nikkei index in Japan. And when we bring that into the larger perspective of the weekly RRG, then you can see that the improvement of the US market, so here's FANG, here's NASDAQ, here's the S&P, is still going on. Here's the Nikkei. They're all inside that weakening quadrant, heading higher. There's a little nudge to the left, that is because of the prior week. And here's the Dow Jones, which is again going into the other direction, quite surprisingly. If you look at the European tails, they're inside improving but rolling over, moving slightly to the right, but they are losing relative momentum, and that's being in line with what we see on the dailies, and it's probably going to be confirmed and show some renewed weakness probably when this continues. So what are the tails that you want to concentrate on? I think the big picture here is that the US is once again outperforming the European market. Hang Seng is a difficult one. It's improving on the weekly, and it rapidly moved lower on the daily. So look at that, the red tail here, that's the Hang Seng index. You see that very rapid rotation back into lagging. So with this strength here, I wouldn't be surprised, because on the weekly, the Hang Seng is still the lowest reading on the RS ratio scale. So I wouldn't be surprised if we're going to see a rotation of the Hang Seng index through improving back down to lagging. When we take that rotation to absolute terms, so using a 0% return benchmark, then you can see the improvement across the board for all stock markets in this universe. They're all moving into that top right-hand quadrant, indicating that those trends are shifting. They're on the left-hand side, which essentially means that the trends are still down, but they're in a bottoming process. That's what it means when you move from improving into leading. And you can see how the Nikkei index is leading this pack here. And then we got the S&P, here's the New York FANG index, Dow Jones also leading here. It's an interesting way to show you basically that this is all based on price performance. So in terms of price performance, they pretty much all move in the same direction. So there's no real difference between those tails. But when you go to that relative rotation, then you can see how the speed of those moves, the speeds of those trends are really different. Then on to some of these individual charts. So here we have the S&P 500, and we can definitely see the rapid rally out of the recent low here. and I've adjusted my trend line slightly. It started right here and it ran over these. It took this low here and it looked as if we had a break, but with the new low in place here, I've now adjusted here and I got like actually 1, 2, 3, 4 touch points. So it's actually even a little bit more reliable than the previous version of that trend line. And what we see is that we rallied and we stopped pretty much exactly at the level of the previous high, which was also the area where we closed the gap that occurred back in September. And then yesterday, so last night, was actually a pretty weak reversal day, pretty much respecting that resistance area around 4390, 4400. So we need to watch and see what's going to happen. I wouldn't be surprised if we got a little bit of a setback here. There's 1 or 2 gaps. We could even go as low as 4200. But you can see that I think that the most important takeaway is that the imminent risk of a massive decline has kind of faded. I mean, there's plenty of room now for the US market, for the S&P 500 to go through some sort of a setback without completely ruining the potential bottoming that's in place right here. If you look at relative strength, you can see that it is trying to start moving higher. It isn't much yet, but it's definitely there. The improvement's definitely there. So that's the positive takeaway for this market. If you look at the Nasdaq index, kind of a similar pattern. This is still moving slightly lower here, but we're out of that falling trend channel. We took out that overhead resistance line and we tested, just like the S&P, the resistance coming off that previous high. And for the Nasdaq, that's around 15,350. But here also last night a nasty reversal, and we're going to wait and see where this is going to stop. Here also 2 gap areas where we may find some sort of a support area. Relative strength starting to improve, a little bit better than in the S&P actually, so that's the good news. Making the US, making Nasdaq and the S&P the more interesting markets to look for long positions actually. And then if you look at the New York FANG, quite similar, coming out of that downtrend, reversal, peaking in the resistance area, coming off those previous highs. And the relative strength, the RRG lines, you can see how they are actually very close to 100 and curling back up, indicating that there is strong relative strength underneath the move for the New York FANG index. And then the Nikkei still struggling with that overhead resistance dating back to mid-October. You can see that we broke, we fell back, and then this morning we actually pulled back up again here. So that's a bit of a unclear situation right now. I think we need to wait until we get clarification that we're really on the way. But there is already a lot of resistance waiting around 33,350 and probably, let's say, that's 34,000. Relative strength is definitely good. So even though the fact that there is some overhead resistance for the Japanese stock market, there is still, in relative terms, a lot to gain there. Now, where are things going the other way? Here you see the Stock 600 in Europe, and as you can see, the rhythm of lower highs and lower lows still intact. Yesterday was a pretty good day, but look at the relative strength. That's what we're concentrating on. We're looking at the relative strength for the stocks against the ACWI, that's the All Country World Index, MSCI All Country World Index. That's definitely pointing down. So from a relative perspective, it's very clear that the European markets are underperforming or very likely to underperform, especially the US markets, as we've seen a little earlier. Now let's take a look at the individual rotations for the members of the New York FANG index. Weekly RRG on the left, daily RRG on the right. And there are a few tails that I want to discuss today. And what I'm looking for are tails that are confirming each other. That's where you get the strongest signals. And when we look at the weekly RRG, then what immediately catches at least my eye is the tail for Microsoft, which is rapidly moving towards that leading quadrant, still inside improving, but at the strong heading and moving towards leading. And the same goes to a lesser degree, it's trading a little bit for AMD. And Snowflake still red, which means that it is still in a relative downtrend, but it's picking up. Apple is in here, but it's rolling over. But Snowflake, AMD, Microsoft, they seem quite interesting. And then when you see Meta rotating from weakening back into leading, that's always a good thing. That's always an interesting thing to look at. And I've got a particular thing I want to show you for Nvidia. It's inside weakening. It's still heading into a negative direction on the weekly, but we got a rapid improvement on the daily chart. So here's your Nvidia. That's the blue one here in improving. We got that rapid rotation over the last few weeks actually already, where you can see Nvidia pushing into improving right now. But also AMD, as I told you, AMD is the green tail right here that's pushing into leading. So that's confirming the improvement that you see here on that weekly RRG. Apple very close to the benchmark, so there's not a lot to gain, not a lot to lose either. We've got Microsoft, which we discussed here on the weekly as a very good tail. It's going through a bit of a setback, but still inside the leading quadrant, losing a bit of momentum. And then there is Meta, which I showed you here. This is the strongest, one of the strongest rotations that you can see, where you rotate through weakening and then go all the way back up and move back into leading. What that actually means is that it's already in a relative uptrend and it went through a bit of a correction and then goes back up. And if you see that on a normal relative strength chart, it's never a straight line. So what you will see is higher highs and higher lows. So you see the swing highs and swing lows on the relative strength line. And this is a move where Meta went through a bit of a correction and now puts in a higher low in terms of relative strength. That's what you see when you see a rotation that takes place, leading, weakening, back to leading. Let's go to the individual charts. So here's Microsoft, and you can see that, and you will see that with many of those New York FANG, and basically across the board, where we are running into resistance. And here this is a little bit of the longer term perspective from Microsoft. You can see how it is actually touching the resistance coming off that July high, the July area high. And again, reversal day here. However, there is plenty of room for a little bit of a setback. We've already seen quite a rally here in Microsoft. So when it sets back, we could go to, I don't know, 350, maybe even 345. We go to AMD. AMD is probably the strongest chart in the New York FANG. And why is that? Because we've left that falling channel, but we've also overcome the resistance coming off those previous highs. And that means that this area here around 111.5, 112 is now likely to act as support in case of a decline in AMD in terms of price. So that gives you quite a bit of upside potential with very downside limited risk. And that's what makes it such an interesting chart. And especially when you look at the relative strength versus the New York FANG index, you can see how that is moving higher. And when the RS ratio and the RS momentum are moving at the same pace, it means that there is an almost 45-degree angle. So you know that between 0 and 90 degrees, that means that they're moving, the stock is moving up on both axes on the RRG. And when it's doing that at the same speed, that gives you an angle of almost 45 degrees. Between 0 and 90 is good, 45 is ideal. And that's when both lines are moving in the same direction at the same pace. Then Snowflake's been under the water for quite some time. Did it again, but the rally, the bounce of the recent low is pretty good, and we're picking up in terms of relative strength. And you saw on the RRGs that it's both on the weekly and on the daily starting to pick up and curl back up into that positive direction. Unlike AMD, Snowflake is still facing a lot of overhead resistance, so we still need to see confirmation, and I think confirmation would be prices above 162. When we take out these subsequent highs, every time you take out a subsequent high, it's getting better and better and better. There is a gap area here that very likely needs to be filled, so that would mean a dip back to 150, 149, 90, well, 150. And then Meta, very strong actually, I gotta say. You can see how we came out of that channel, but we moved into a sideways pattern, and we're now pushing against overhead resistance. It's not all-time high levels yet, but it's definitely an important overhead resistance area. It is 326, the extreme here is 330. So let's say that's 330 is resistance for Meta. We do need to overcome it, but what I'm looking at here, as you can see, and when I magnify it, you see it better, is that RS momentum, that momentum of relative trend is slowly starting to pick up. That's the first improvement that you want to see. And when we're pushing against that overhead resistance, as you see it here in the price chart, that's an interesting area to watch. As soon as you get above 330 in Meta, I think you will see an acceleration because a lot of overhead supply will be taken out, and if there's no supply left but there is demand, you very often get an acceleration in terms of price. And then finally I want to talk about Nvidia. Quite similar pattern here. There's a little bit of a jump towards 500. But the thing with Nvidia is that we were all looking for this massive head and shoulders pattern. So here was the left shoulder, here was the head, and here was the right shoulder. And then we broke that neckline, and that was kind of a negative signal, you know, like, oh right, here is a head and shoulders top in Nvidia. It's the end, usually takes place at the end of a long trend, which completely ticks all the boxes. But what happened then is that it reversed, and it reversed back above the neckline, and we're now rallying. And a failed head and shoulders pattern is one of the most bullish signs you can get. So Nvidia, in my opinion, showed a failed head and shoulders pattern, already back to the level of the previous high. Obviously, it was not a good day yesterday. We closed around the low end of the day, but look at the relative strength, how that improved. I'm going to watch Nvidia if that can get significantly above 476, and especially when it can take out 500. There is another rally for Nvidia on the cards, in my view. So this is actually a failed pattern here. So there was a head and shoulders, it's a failed pattern, and that is very often the reverse move very rapidly, and you already saw that happening from roughly 415 to around 470 where we currently are. After a bit of a correction, there's probably more to go there. I'm going to wrap it up here. Thank you for watching, and I hope you enjoyed the show. In case you would like to reach out, please use any of the handles on the screen. And as usual, I'm looking forward to seeing you again at a new update by RRG Research next week. Same time, same place.